This video is brought to you by Roon 2.0, the revolutionary music player designed for true music fanatics. Click to roonlabs.com for more information.
In this video, I want to talk about a truly most excellent turntable from Cambridge-Audio, and it's called the Alva TT2. Now, we're not going to do the usual thing where I conduct side-by-side comparisons to another turntable, because the turntable I brought with me to do that for this Cambridge actually got damaged in transit. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my sort of overall personal theory of everything when it comes to hi-fi, and I'm going to make references to my own internal dialogue along the way, and we're going to cover a lot of gear, a lot of different things. So I think that even if you're not into vinyl or records or analog playback at all, you're still going to get something from this video. So essentially, there are two trains of thought that exist inside my head when it comes to hi-fi and music playback at home and also out of the house. And they are what I call my inner pragmatist and my inner idealist. Now, my inner pragmatist pushes me towards Bluetooth active noise cancelling headphones and streaming active loudspeakers. But my inner idealist has other ideas, and he wants me to go towards separates, passive speakers, vinyl playback, CDs. So yeah, almost the opposite direction. And you can see those opposite directions behind me today because I've got two pairs of speakers. So I've been living with two different hi-fi systems for the past 2 or 3 weeks. Certainly the last 2 weeks since I had this room acoustically treated. So let's start with my inner pragmatist's hi-fi system. And that is the Buchardt A700. The tall white floor stander. Now this is a active loudspeaker. I was going to say it's a streaming active loudspeaker, but it isn't really. So the streaming component comes from the plug-in hub, and that then sends any incoming signals that it receives out to the speakers wirelessly using something called WiSA. We've made a video about this before. I'll put links in the description box below. And in this room, the A700 sound big, bold, bombastic in the bass. They measure really well in this room with Room EQ Wizard. I'm using the stock neutral master tuning. That's the voicing of the speaker that I can change at any time should I wish. And it only takes 5 minutes and a USB stick to do so. So for me, I think the Buchardt A700 are like peak Future-Fi because they're an all-in-one, they're simple to set up, and everything really connects to the plug-in hub. So if I want to play CDs, I can connect that to the plug-in hub. And if I want to spin vinyl, like from my Cambridge-Audio Alva TT2, easy for you to say, I can also connect that to the plug-in hub. And to do so, I have to move a switch on the back of the turntable to put it into line level mode, so to engage its internal phono stage. And then we connect the turntable directly analog out from it to the analog in on the plug-in hub, and that then streams the signal wirelessly using WiSA out to the loudspeakers. So my inner pragmatist is very happy with that arrangement. But my inner idealist, yeah, he doesn't like it so much. And that's because of the digitization that goes on inside the plug-in hub when the analog signal comes out of the turntable, goes into the hub, and then there's an ADC, an analog to digital converter, which converts the turntable's output into a digital signal so it can be streamed wirelessly, also so that the plug-in hub can execute the room correction, because the plug-in hub does room correction, as we know, or if you watch my previous video, you'll know that. Now that's important. That's a very important ingredient, a very important factor in this story, because my inner pragmatist says, well, okay, the room correction holds sway here. It gives us more than the ADC would possibly or could possibly take away from the purity of the analog stream coming into the plug-in hub. But my inner idealist is like, nah, that ADC is shaving maybe 1 to 2% off the top. Now we know this because, or rather we can guess this or intuit this, because we know that all DACs sound different, and more affordable DACs sound, I guess, fine, good, excellent, and then possibly, but not always, more expensive DACs sound absolutely bloody fantastic, going up to amazing, going up to life-changing. So there is a range of performance we get from DACs. Those are digital to analog converters, essentially the opposite of an analog to digital converter, which goes the other way. Now, just as an analog output stage is critical to a DAC's sound, the analog input stage is critical to an ADC's sound. Now, even though I guess that the ADC inside the Platin hub is only shaving 1 to 2% off the top of overall sound quality, it's still taking something away. And I'm guessing this because the ADC inside that Platin hub isn't going to be a super uber high-end solution. The input stage, the analog input stage on that ADC is going to be fairly basic, just as the analog output stage would be in a fairly affordable DAC. And if you think that we can sneak around the Platin hub's ADC and just feed our turntable signal directly into the Buchardt loudspeakers using their own XLR inputs on the back of each speaker, you need to think again, because there is an ADC greeting those XLR inputs as well, because it needs to digitize the signal coming into the speaker in order to execute the DSP that handles the master tuning of that loudspeaker, so the voicing of that loudspeaker. And you should really hear my inner idealist go off when I think about the Bluetooth output on the Cambridge-Audio Alva TT2 turntable, which I think is one key ingredient that makes it a futurified turntable. The other one really being something that's more common than a Bluetooth output, and that's the internal phono stage. But that Bluetooth output really triggers my inner idealist. Even though it works as advertised, I think it sounds fantastic, and it gives me the flexibility to move around the house whilst playing vinyl. I'm not chained to the hi-fi system with a pair of wired headphones. I can go upstairs, I can go to the kitchen, and I can still get that sort of vinyl sound, if it exists, into a pair of headphones with maximum mobility around the house. And my inner idealist is also why I have a pair of Zoo Soul 6 loudspeakers behind me as well. They're a passive loudspeaker, and they're not as impactful in the low end. I really think they need a subwoofer. The A700 don't, but the Zoo do. But the Zoo do things that the Buchardt don't, in that they have an immediacy and they have an intimacy, especially at low levels. Now, I know that Buchardt have implemented Fletcher-Munson curve correction in their loudspeakers, so they are one of the better active loudspeakers out there at low levels. Basically, they pull the bass and the treble up as you turn the volume down. But for me, for my inner idealist, rather than my inner pragmatist, my inner idealist loves the Zoos because even at low volumes, they really are still alive with microdynamic flicker and flare, and I don't really feel the need to crank them up to get the most fun out of them. Moreover, when I play that new 2023 remix of Bob Dylan's Time Out of Mind through the Zoos, I get a sense of sonic purity that I don't really get from the Bucharts, even though the Bucharts and their concrete slab-like sub-bass foundation is a much better fit than the Zoo for something like Massive Attack's Mezzanine. But we'll add subs to the Zoo loudspeakers down the line. That's coming in another video. Now, of course, the Zoo's performance is largely, or to a certain degree, determined by the amplifier that's driving them. And I started out with an NAD M10 V2, mainly because it has a room correction built in, Dirac Live room correction, but also because it's a Kallax box, so it's small, it's very sleek, its industrial design is very modern, very Future-Fi. Also, Future-Fi is the front panel, so it's a touch screen, there are no physical controls, we get VU meters on some inputs, we get a nice now playing display, and I think it's a wonderful match for the Zoo loudspeakers, and it's very compact because all the streaming is built in, the DAC is built in, and we don't really need anything else. Although if we want to use headphones, we have to rely on its Bluetooth streaming output, which again, my inner idealist is like, nah, but my inner pragmatist is like, you winner. But my inner idealist also wants to have a bit of a grizzle and a grumble about the ADC inside the NAD M10V2. Because in order for its analog input to be routed through the Dirac Live room correction DSP, it must be converted to digital upon entry, and that therefore means an ADC at the sort of the reception gates of the analog input going into that NAD amplifier. So that means when I've connected the Alva TT2's line level output to the line level input on the back of the NAD amplifier, that sort of precious and pure analog signal is being converted to digital. And yeah, my inner pragmatist doesn't really care, but my inner idealist is like, nah, don't like it. And even though my inner pragmatist knows that the room correction will give me far more than the ADC takes away, the inner idealist in me doesn't really care too much for room correction, especially now as I've had this room treated. My inner idealist is really kind of, yeah, it talks to me a bit louder, or he talks to me a bit louder. Yeah, I've got voices in my head. Talks to me a bit louder now that I've had this room done. He's like, well, you don't need room correction anymore. So, you know, why would you put up with an ADC in your amplifier? Now, before I tell you where I went next with amplifiers, I want to talk about 6 things that I really love about the Alva TT2, it's hard to say, turntable from Cambridge-Audio. And these 6 things are really nothing to do with sound quality. They're more sort of practical considerations that appeal to my inner pragmatist. The first one is the industrial design. It's a cool and sleek looking turntable. And I think it looks absolutely fantastic. And for a direct drive turntable that doesn't look like a Technics, I think that's a win in and of itself. Not there's anything wrong with the Technics look and feel, but I gotta say, I prefer the more understated, cooler look of the Cambridge-Audio turntable. The second thing I like is the 5-minute setup. To unbox it, it only takes, 30 seconds? It's really beautifully packaged. Cambridge-Audio's packaging on its high-end gear is some of the best I've ever seen. And once the turntable is leveled on a surface, all we have to do is screw on the head shell, which already has a cartridge mounted to it. It's Cambridge-Audio's own. I don't know who made it for them, but it's an cartridge. So yeah, we screw that head shell on, and then all we have to do is set the tracking force. And Cambridge also supply a fairly basic sort of tracking force weight in the box, but I used my own to double check that it was right on 2 grams. The third thing that I like is that there is no felt mat with this turntable. I love that. I hate those felt mats. They always stick to the under the side of the record when you lift a record off because of the static charge that's built up. Number 4, because this is a direct drive turntable, we get instantaneous push button start, stop and speed change. No faffing about with having to move a belt and lifting off the platter. No, none of that kind of nonsense that I really don't like with certain entry-level turntables. So this one is a direct drive. It's just push this, push that, start, stop. It works wonderfully. The 5th thing that I really like is that this turntable feels nice to use. It's heavy, it feels solid. The tone arm, when you lift it across, I've got no complaints about that, but I don't generally on most high-end turntables like this. But also, the tone arm lever is super smooth, and you don't have to nurse the cartridge onto the record surface by always holding the tone arm until it's all the way down. You can actually bring the cartridge above the leading groove and then just slowly move the tone arm and then let go. And then the tone arm will lower itself very slowly and carefully. So I think that's a real win, because that's not always the case on every single high-end turntable that I've ever used. And number 6 relates to number 2, in that because this is a detachable head shell, we can now change up the cartridge. We couldn't do that on version 1 of the Alva TT. We were locked into Cambridge's own cartridge, but now we're not. So we could swap it out if we wanted to. But as we'll see later on, I've got no intention of doing that. And there are also two key features of this turntable that make my inner idealist very happy. The first is that the internal phono stage can be bypassed. So if I wanted to upgrade down the line to a better external box, then I would. But I probably won't, as we'll see. And the second thing that makes my inner idealist really happy is that the Bluetooth transmitter can be turned off, because my inner idealist would never use the Bluetooth function, but my inner pragmatist is quite happy wandering about the house listening to vinyl. But yeah, my inner idealist is like, nope, that's terrible. Now, along with the Alva TT2 turntable, Cambridge also sent me an Evo 150 streaming integrated amplifier. I've reviewed this before, but I think it's a fairly good stand-in, theoretically and physically, in terms of its aesthetics and looks for the NAD M10V2. But there are some key differences. For example, the Cambridge audio, I think, looks better on the top of the Kallax unit, because then we can see the nice sort of wooden side cheeks that it has. The Cambridge audio unit also has physical volume and source selector buttons. So if a song comes on Roon radio that I really like, it's much easier for me than the NAD to reach down and just crank the volume on the Evo 150. I really like that. On the other hand, the display, the now playing screen on the Cambridge is a bit busier than it is on the NAD. I think it would satisfy the nerdier listener who wants to see bit rate, sample rate, and some of the other bits of information that the NAD doesn't display so readily. But the Evo 150 also gives us inbuilt Chromecast streaming support, and the NAD doesn't. Now, I love Chromecast because when I'm using my Android phone and I want to listen to a DJ mix on SoundCloud and that DJ mix is not available anywhere else in the world, I can Chromecast it very easily over to the Cambridge. And I can't do that with the NAD. I have to use my iPhone and use AirPlay in that situation. And I really like Chromecast because it doesn't depend on the phone being always on to execute the stream. The stream does not travel through the phone on the way to the amplifier as it does with AirPlay. However, the Evo 150 only gives us one subwoofer output, and the NAD has two independent subwoofer outputs with DSP-based bass management software inside the amplifier. So I'm going to be using the NAD when I add subwoofers to the Zoo loudspeakers. But the Evo 150 also has balanced XLR inputs. That I think my inner idealist really likes, at least in theory. The Evo 150 also has an internal phono stage, which again my inner idealist likes. My pragmatist likes it as well. And there's also an auxiliary analog line level input on the back, which I've used to connect the Alva TT2 turntable to the Cambridge unit. But what really excites my inner idealist here is that auxiliary analog line level input is not digitized upon entry. Well, not unless you use some of the tone controls, but I don't use those at all. So basically the signal moves from the analog input all the way through the amplifier and back out through the loudspeaker binding posts entirely in the analog domain. And my inner idealist, my vinyl loving inner idealist, yeah, really digs that. I'll just touch on the differences that I hear between these two amplifiers when using the turntable as a line level source, because I think the NAD has slightly, ever so slightly, top to bottom clarity. But I think the Cambridge Evo 150 is a bit more hooded up top, so not quite as well extended as the NAD, again a small difference. But for me it has a more substantial mid-range. It sounds meatier, it sounds chewier, if I might use that word. I'm sorry if you object to that word. I don't know, just move on. But what that means to me when listening to vocal music, so Robyn, Hitchcock and David Byrne that I bought on vinyl recently, it means that those voices kind of sit closer to the stomach with the Cambridge than they do through the NAD, where they sound a little bit, just a small bit again, a little bit chestier. I'm talking about audiophile differences here. The ones that my inner idealist wants me to hone in on and really blow up and maximize, when really, when my inner pragmatist looks at them and goes, well, they're kind of small differences that won't really matter to most people. What will matter to most people, I think, is the Dirac Live room correction inside the NAD that the Cambridge does not have. So I think the NAD might be the pragmatist's choice here, but my inner idealist is all about the Evo 150 from Cambridge, because it's analog in, analog out, and nothing digital in between. And that means when I'm playing Robyn Hitchcock's Groovy Decay on vinyl with the Cambridge turntable through the Cambridge amplifier, and also David Byrne's Momo, I get a better sense, again, small difference, but a better sense of sonic purity. There is something a little bit sweeter about the sound coming out of the Cambridge than that comes out of the NAD using the turntable as the line level source. But of course, my inner pragmatist is like, no, the Dirac Live in the NAD is the way to go, because it gives us much more in return for sacrificing a little bit of that sonic purity. In that, I think Dirac Live sort of spreads the sound between the speakers more. Its imaging is better. I think also with Dirac Live applied to the Zoo Soul 6 in this room, it pulls down that mid-range peak a little bit, which I think some people would like. I don't really care, to be honest, where there's a bit of a mid-range bump, because I quite like that from the Zoos in their sort of stock mode in this room. But yeah, my inner pragmatist wants the Dirac Live from the NAD M10V2, and my inner idealist is like, no, I want the sonic purity from vinyl going into the Cambridge Evo 150. So there's this constant battle going on inside my head about which way to go. Now, maybe my inner idealist's objection to the NAD is basically because there's an ADC applied to that line level input, and it's probably taking a little bit off the top. And maybe it's just a theoretical objection, because we can't know how much the ADC takes off the top because we can't remove it. But my inner idealist really likes what he hears from the Cambridge, because it has a certain sense of, yes, sonic purity that the NAD doesn't give us, Dirac on or off. But the really spicy finding is this, is that last week I was kind of going backwards and forwards between the vinyl of Robyn Hitchcock's Groovy Decay and the vinyl of David Byrne's Momo, and the CD rips that I have on my Roon server upstairs. And they are definitely the same master generations, because I know that the Robyn Hitchcock album has been remastered twice over the last, 30 years? The David Byrne album has not, but I make sure that I went back to the original master of the Robyn Hitchcock, and obviously there's only one original master of the David Byrne. So I was going backwards and forwards between vinyl and Roon streaming. And I've got to say, and I don't hear this very often, I thought that the vinyl playback sounded bigger, taller, meatier, chunkier in terms of like the physicality of instruments, even though it didn't sound quite as lit up or as clean or as crisp as the Roon stream. And that for me was, yeah, a spicy finding. It was a big surprise. And it also tells us that the internal phono stage inside the Cambridge turntable isn't terrible. It can't be if it sounds that good through the Cambridge amplifier. It really does. And I've got to say, I'm surprised, and I'm a little bit, not shaken up by it, but the last time I heard a high-end turntable sound better than a digital stream or even a CD was with the Project Extension 10, which is a much more expensive turntable. Now, I'm not saying that all vinyl sounds better than all streams. That would be preposterous. That's the kind of black and white thinking that people tend to engage with elsewhere on the internet. I don't want any part of it. My findings here are unique to the Cambridge-Audio Alva TT2, connected line level to the Cambridge-Audio Evo 150. That is it. But the thing is, I don't hear that delta between the vinyl and the streaming when I go back to the NAD M10V2. It just doesn't really present, even though the Dirac Live does something altogether different. But if I'm in the mood, or if my inner idealist is in the driving seat and he demands sonic purity, then it's the Cambridge Audio Evo with the Alva TT2 turntable every time for me, for him. I also double checked this with a couple of electronic albums and found the same result. So those electronic music albums were Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 1, and also everybody's favorite, or every audiophile's favorite, almost becoming a cliche, is Trentemöller's The Last Resort. Now, right now, vinyl refuseniks will be queuing up to tell my inner idealist that pretty much 99.9% of all records or vinyl records made nowadays are cut from a high-res digital file. And they would be absolutely correct. So we have to ask ourselves, how is it that a high-res file, when diverted to a big black disc, put on a turntable and then read by having a rock dragged across its surface, can somehow sound bigger and fuller and chunkier and meatier than the high-res file played directly through the DAC in the same amplifier? Now, I think there are two reasons why, or two possible reasons why. I don't know for sure. The first one relates to mastering, because most mastering engineers will create a second, slightly different master to cut the record than they do that goes out to make the CD and goes out to streaming services. But perhaps a more likely explanation is that not all additional components to a playback chain remove sound quality. Not all of them. And I know that goes against the thinking behind Occam's razor. So for example, if I put a preamp between a streaming DAC's volume controlled output and a power amplifier, I prefer the preamp in the chain. It makes things sound, meatier, chunkier, fuller, fleshier, even though it takes away some of the zippiness of the sound of going DAC direct into the power amp. That's one example. The second example of this, I'd never heard until last week when I visited my friend Alessandro Cortini at his studio. And he's got a synclavier synthesizer and he's really into it right now. And he played me a sample that he'd taken back in Berlin, basically direct from his computer out for the speakers. I'm like, okay. But then he routed that sample through the synclavier before going to the loudspeakers. And it sounded bigger, fuller, fatter, taller, wider. To me, it just sounded better. To Alessandro, it sounds better. So sometimes more can be more. But of course, what I don't know at this stage is if another turntable fed into the Evo 150 would give me the same result. I just don't know because I don't have a functioning turntable here to test it. And I guess really, I think the SL1500C from Technics that we've made a video about before, link below, that would be the closer cousin to the Alva TT2 from Cambridge because it has an internal phono stage and the SL1200s and 1210s do not. But there's no Bluetooth streaming output on any Technics turntable. So this video is really about, I guess, the journey through hi-fi. Some people like the journey more than the destination. But my destination was an unexpected one in that I found this sort of sonic purity from vinyl playback, so almost like vinyl nirvana, in a fairly unexpected place, because previously I guess I'd always thought that having room correction trumped everything no matter what. And my inner idealist has kind of reminded me that that's not always the case. So now there really is a trade-off to be made, and I guess I have to choose. Well, I don't have to choose actually, because I've got two hi-fi systems here, very self-indulgent of me, so I can flip between the two. So generally speaking, if I want to watch TV or stream music, especially electronic music, I'll route it through the Buchardt system. But if I want to play vinyl, and if I want that intimacy, I've got the low-level listening that really comes alive from the zoos, and I've got the sonic purity that they give me, but also this sort of sonic purity that the turntable, all analog, through the Cambridge-Audio Evo 150 gives me. So I win in both ways, but in different ways. So to say that one is better than the other, no, it's just not possible. It just depends upon where your priorities lie. For me, I'm kind of torn down the middle, and I have been for a long time. And this is really the first time I've spoken about it. And I was really anticipating just doing a kind of more of a traditional review of the Cambridge-Audio Alva TT2 turntable, but the last couple of weeks have been, well, obviously quite tumultuous because I'm in a new house now, but I guess in playing around with all this gear, yeah, I found something out that I thought was quite interesting and I thought I would share with you. So yeah, this is kind of my grand theory of everything as it relates to hi-fi and the two different trains of thought that constantly sort of almost battle each other inside my head. And yeah, how essentially one is not necessarily better than the other, it's just different. A bit like how I play CDs, I also play records, and I also stream music. And everything has its advantages and everything has its disadvantages, right? So there is no perfect way to listen to music, whether it be vinyl or CDs or streaming. And there is no perfect way to play back that music, whether it's vinyl through an all analog system or streaming through essentially an all digital system. So yeah, this Alva TT2 is not going back to Cambridge. I'm going to keep it here. In fact, it's so good, I might try and take it back to Berlin with me when I go there in a few weeks, because I want to see if it sounds as good in my other setups back in Germany. I don't know, but here it just, like every time I sit down and listen to a record on this turntable through the Zoo speakers, I'm just like, wow, this sounds just wonderful. Like I'm so happy with the sound that I've got with that vinyl setup. And I am very happy with the Buchardt sound, but it's bigger and more bombastic and not quite as pure or as intimate. It's a different vibe. But again, as I keep saying, it's not worse, it's not better. Anyway, this was a very long video, like really long. And I went around the houses probably to make my point. I'm sorry if I did that. Please understand that we covered a lot of gear in this video, so there's a lot of breadth to it. And that means we had to sacrifice some depth, obviously. So please, please, please keep that in mind when leaving a comment below. But if you like this video, if you thought it was informative or entertaining or a bit of both, then yeah, please give us a like down below. If you like my attitude towards high-end audio gear that now tears me down the middle, then please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.